The desert wind carried more than sand that day. It carried the echo of abandonment, the weight of betrayal, and the desperate hope that somewhere in the vast emptiness of Xerion Prime, mercy might still exist. This is the story of a geological surveyor who thought he was just collecting mineral samples, and an exiled warrior who thought she would die forgotten beneath alien stars. What happened between them would challenge everything both species believed about compassion, courage, and what it truly means to carry someone home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Chen wiped sweat from his forehead as he adjusted the mineral scanner strapped to his wrist. The crimson gorge stretched endlessly before him, its rust-colored walls rising like ancient monuments against Xerion Prime's pale orange sky. 3 weeks of geological surveys had yielded promising data about rare earth deposits, but the isolation was beginning to wear on him. The nearest human outpost lay 400 kilometers away, and his only company was the rhythmic beeping of detection equipment and the occasional skittering of desert creatures across the canyon floor. The morning had started like any other on this desolate world. Marcus methodically worked his way through grid section 7, taking core samples and updating his digital maps. The acidic smell that preceded Xerion's notorious rainstorms hung in the air, warning him to seek shelter soon. These weren't ordinary rainstorms. The precipitation on this planet carried enough corrosive minerals to strip paint from metal and burn exposed skin. Most intelligent species had long ago learned to respect the sky's warnings. His scanner began registering unusual energy signatures. Near an abandoned mining platform about 2 kilometers deeper into the gorge, the readings were inconsistent with natural mineral formations. Marcus frowned, checking the device's calibration. Corporate had briefed him about old Velani extraction sites scattered throughout this region, remnants from when the warrior species had attempted their own mining operations decades ago. Most had been stripped clean and left to decay, but occasionally they contained salvageable technology worth investigating. As Marcus climbed over a ridge of weathered sandstone, the first drops of rain began to fall. He quickened his pace, knowing he had perhaps 20 minutes before the shower became dangerous. The abandoned platform came into view, a twisted skeleton of metal and ceramic jutting from the canyon wall like broken bones. Acid damage had eaten through most of the support structures, leaving the facility partially collapsed and hanging at a precarious angle. That's when he heard it. Not the usual sounds of wind through metal or the distant rumble of approaching storms. This was different, organic, a low moan that seemed to pulse with pain and exhaustion. Marcus stopped, listening intently. The sound came again, weaker this time, barely audible above the increasing patter of rain against rock. Someone was down there. Someone was alive. Marcus activated his emergency beacon's recording function and began moving toward the platform, his boots sliding on increasingly slick stone. The rain was becoming heavier, and each drop that hit his exposed arms left tiny red marks. He pulled up his hood and increased his pace, following the intermittent sounds of distress. The energy readings on his scanner were growing stronger, but now they seemed less like technology and more like the biosignatures his equipment sometimes picked up from larger life forms. Reaching the edge of the platform, Marcus peered down into what had once been the facility's main processing bay. The metal floor was twisted and partially collapsed, creating deep shadows and hidden alcoves. Rain poured through gaps in the overhead structure, forming caustic puddles that hissed and steamed where they collected. In the growing gloom, he could barely make out the source of the sounds that had drawn him here. There, wedged between a fallen support beam and a chunk of collapsed ceiling, lay a figure that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. It was clearly Velani, recognizable by the distinctive gray-blue skin tone and elongated limbs that characterized the species. But this individual was unlike any Velani he had seen in the corporate briefing videos. She was smaller, more delicate somehow, and covered in wounds that spoke of deliberate violence rather than accidental injury. Her left leg was trapped beneath. Debris and dark fluid that could only be blood had pooled around her position. Geometric scars covered her arms and face, but these weren't the ritual markings Marcus had read about in xenological reports. These were fresh, crude, and clearly meant to mark her as something shameful. Most disturbing of all, she had been stripped of the traditional armor and weapons that Velani wore as symbols of status. Instead, she lay nearly naked in the rain, abandoned to die slowly in a place where no one would ever find her. The rain was becoming acidic enough that Marcus could feel it beginning to sting through his protective clothing. Soon it would be lethal for any unprotected life form. The Velani woman stirred slightly, her breathing shallow and labored. One of her arms moved weakly, as if trying to shield herself from the burning precipitation, but she lacked the strength to achieve even that small protection. Marcus made his decision in that instant. Corporate protocols, diplomatic considerations, and personal safety all became secondary to the simple fact that a sentient being was dying in front of him, and he had the power to help. He began climbing down into the ruined facility, his movements careful but urgent. The metal groaned ominously under his weight, and acidic rainwater dripped steadily from above, but Marcus pressed forward. As he drew closer, he could see that her injuries were even worse than they had appeared from above. This wasn't just abandonment. This was execution by exposure, a deliberate and cruel method of ensuring death while maintaining the fiction that natural forces had been responsible. The metal ladder leading down to the processing bay had been weakened by years of acid rain exposure, and several rungs crumbled under Marcus's weight as he descended. Each step sent vibrations through the unstable structure, causing loose debris to rain down around the trapped Velani woman. She stirred at the sound, her head turning slightly toward him, and Marcus caught his first clear glimpse of her face. What he saw there stopped him cold. Her eyes, a striking amber color that seemed to glow even in the dim light, were filled with a mixture of pain, resignation, and something else that took him a moment to identify. Terror, not the kind of fear that came from physical injury, but the deep, primal terror of someone who had been utterly betrayed by everything they had once trusted. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her lips moved silently, forming words in a language Marcus didn't recognize, but the tone was unmistakably that of prayer or pleading. The geometric scars covering her body were even more disturbing up close. They formed intricate patterns that Marcus realized were not random markings but deliberate symbols. Having studied basic Velani cultural materials for his assignment on Xerion Prime, he recognized some of the designs as indicators of shame and exile. Someone had taken great care to mark this woman as something to be despised and abandoned, carving the symbols deep enough to ensure they would never fully heal. Marcus moved closer, and the woman's breathing became rapid and shallow. She tried to push herself further back against the debris that trapped her, despite the obvious agony the movement caused. Her mouth opened, and she spoke in heavily accented but recognizable Standard Galactic. "Stay back, human. Do not defile yourself by touching the marked one." Her voice was hoarse from dehydration and pain, but carried an odd formality that suggested these were words she had been taught to say, not ones that came naturally to her. The rain was intensifying rapidly now, and Marcus could feel it beginning to eat through his protective gear. Small wisps of steam rose from where the droplets hit the metal around them, and the air itself was becoming difficult to breathe. He had perhaps 10 minutes before the precipitation became lethal even for him, and this woman had been exposed to it for who knew how long. "I'm not going anywhere," Marcus said, pulling off his outer jacket and holding it above both of them as An improvised shelter. You're hurt, and this rain is going to kill us both if we don't get you out of here. The woman stared at him with those luminous amber eyes, clearly struggling to process his words. You do not understand. I am sandmarked, exiled, to help. Me is to invite the judgment of the desert upon yourself. I am meant to die here. Marcus knelt beside her, carefully examining the debris that pinned her leg without touching her yet. The support beam was massive, easily weighing several hundred kilograms, but the way it had fallen created a fulcrum point that might allow him to leverage it up if he could find the right angle. The bigger problem was that her leg appeared to be severely fractured, possibly in multiple places, and moving her incorrectly could cause permanent damage. I don't care what you're marked as, he said, setting down his scanner and pulling a compact hydraulic jack from his equipment pack. I care that you're bleeding, and this storm is getting worse every second. As if to emphasize his point, a particularly large piece of corroded metal broke free from the ceiling and crashed down nearby, sending up a shower of sparks and acidic water. The woman flinched at the sound, and Marcus noticed that her entire body was trembling. Though whether from cold, pain, or shock, he couldn't determine. What is your name? He asked as he positioned the jack under the support beam, hoping that conversation might help keep her conscious and focused. She hesitated for so long that Marcus thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible above the drumming of rain on metal. I was called Kira Thomases of the Third Warrior Caste, sworn to the mountain clans of Viridian Peak. She paused, and when she continued, her tone had changed to something flat and emotionless. Now I am no one. The marked have no names. Marcus looked up from his work. I'm Marcus Chen, geological surveyor, currently assigned to grid section 7 of the Crimson Gorge. He met her eyes directly. And I'm going to call you Kira, because that's who you are. Something flickered across her face at those words, an expression so brief Marcus almost missed it. Surprise, perhaps, or the ghost of some emotion she had thought permanently buried. But it was quickly replaced by renewed wariness as Marcus began to pump the hydraulic jack. You risk contamination, she said urgently. Not just from the acid. Rain, from me. My people believe that exile is contagious, that those who help the marked become marked themselves. Your own kind will cast you out if they learn of this. The jack was beginning to lift the beam, but progress was slow. Marcus had to be extremely careful not to shift the weight in a way that might cause the entire pile of debris to collapse further. Sweat was mixing with acid rain on his face, creating a burning sensation that he tried to ignore. My own kind aren't here, he said through gritted teeth as he worked. It's just you and me and this storm. And I've never been particularly good at following rules anyway. Kira studied his face intently, as if searching for some sign of deception or hidden motive. Why? She asked finally. Why do this for someone you do not know, of a species that has warred with yours? The beam shifted slightly, and Marcus could see that Kira's leg was beginning to come free. The limb was badly damaged, twisted at an unnatural angle and covered in both old and fresh blood. But she was still alive, still conscious, and that was what mattered right now. Because, Marcus said, preparing to make the final push that would free her completely, leaving someone to die when you can help them isn't survival. It's just cruelty with a better name. The hydraulic jack reached its maximum extension with a metallic groan that echoed through the ruined facility. The support being lifted just enough to create a narrow gap, but Marcus could see immediately that it wouldn't hold for long. The entire structure was unstable, and the additional pressure from the jack was causing stress fractures to spider across nearby metal joints. He had seconds, maybe a minute at most, before the whole arrangement collapsed. When I tell you to move, you pull your leg out as fast as you can, Marcus instructed, positioning himself to grab Kira if she couldn't manage it herself. Don't worry about the pain, just focus on getting free. Kira nodded, her amber eyes locked on his face with an intensity that spoke of absolute trust, despite everything she had said about contamination and exile. Her hands gripped the edges of nearby debris, preparing to pull herself backward the moment her leg was clear. "Now," Marcus said. The movement was excruciating. Kira's sharp intake of breath echoed through the facility as her mangled leg came free from the trap that had held her. Marcus immediately saw the full extent of the damage and felt his stomach clench. The limb was broken in at least 3 places, with compound fractures visible through tears in her gray-blue skin. Worse, the bleeding was more severe than he had initially realized, suggesting internal damage beyond what he could treat in the field. The support beam crashed back down with tremendous force, just as Kira cleared the danger zone, sending up a shower of sparks and twisted metal fragments. The sound was deafening, but Marcus was already moving, scooping Kira into his arms despite her weakened protests. She was lighter than he had expected, her body dehydrated and weakened by exposure. But her injuries made every movement potentially dangerous. "There's an emergency shelter protocol built into these old mining platforms," Marcus said, carrying her toward what remained of the facility's control room. "Basic atmospheric processors, emergency power, maybe even medical supplies if we're lucky." The acid rain was falling heavily now, each drop capable of causing serious burns to exposed skin. Marcus pulled his jacket up over both of them as he navigated through the wreckage, but he could feel the fabric beginning to deteriorate under the corrosive assault. They needed real shelter, and they needed it immediately. The control room had partially collapsed, but one section remained intact, sealed behind a heavy blast door that had protected it from decades of environmental damage. Marcus set Kira down gently against a wall and began working on the doors. Manual override system. His geological equipment included several tools designed for accessing abandoned installations, and after several minutes of careful work, the doors cycled open with a hiss of stale but breathable air. Inside, emergency lighting flickered to life, revealing a small but functional space equipped with basic life support systems. Most importantly, the atmospheric processor was still operational, filtering out the toxic elements from outside air and maintaining a safe environment. Marcus carried Kira inside and sealed the door behind them, finally allowing himself to relax slightly as the immediate threat of acid exposure was removed. Kira lay where he had placed her, her breathing shallow but steady. The geometric scars covering her body were even more visible in the steady light, and Marcus could see that they formed complex patterns that seemed to tell a story of disgrace and punishment. But beneath the markings, her natural skin tone was that of someone who had once been strong and healthy, suggesting that her exile was recent rather than a lifelong condition. "There should be medical supplies," Marcus said, searching through storage lockers mounted on the walls. These emergency shelters were designed to support mining crews during storms or equipment failures. He found what he was looking for in the third locker he checked. A complete field medical kit, designed for treating injuries in remote locations where professional medical care was unavailable. It wasn't sophisticated, but it contained everything he needed to stabilize Kira's condition until they could reach proper facilities. "This is going to hurt," Marcus warned as he prepared antiseptic solutions and began cleaning the wounds on her leg. "But I need to stop the bleeding and reduce the risk of infection." Kira gripped the edges of the bench where she lay, her knuckles turning darker as Marcus worked. Despite the obvious agony, she made no sound beyond occasional sharp intakes of breath. Her tolerance for pain was remarkable, speaking to a warrior training that ran deeper than whatever circumstances had led to her exile. As Marcus carefully splinted the broken bones and wrapped them in stabilizing bandages, Kira spoke, in a voice barely above a whisper. "You work with great skill for someone who studies rocks instead of medicine. Field geology isn't as different from emergency medicine as you might think," Marcus replied, his attention focused on ensuring the splint was properly aligned. Both require careful observation, precise technique, and the ability to work under pressure. Besides, when you work alone in remote locations, you learn to handle medical emergencies yourself. When he finished with her leg, Marcus turned his attention to the other injuries covering her body. Many of the geometric scars were infected, suggesting they had been made with unclean instruments or deliberately contaminated to increase suffering. He cleaned each wound carefully, noting that whoever had marked her had possessed both anatomical knowledge and a sadistic creativity that made him feel sick. "Who did this to you?" he asked as he worked, though he kept his voice neutral and clinical. Kira was quiet for so long that Marcus thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of profound betrayal. "My own Blade sisters, the warriors I had trained with since childhood, fought beside through 3 campaigns, shared blood and victory with for over a decade." She paused, staring at the ceiling. "They held me down while the clan elders carved the marks of cowardice into my flesh." Marcus's hand stilled for a moment as the implications of her words sank in. What could possibly justify that kind of treatment? "I refuse to execute prisoners," Kira said simply. "During our last raid against a Terran mining operation on Kesslian 7, we captured 12 humans. The clan demanded their ritual sacrifice to honor our fallen warriors. I argued for ransom instead, claimed that killing defenseless captives brought no honor to our cause." Her amber eyes met his directly. "I was overruled, but when the moment came, I could not bring myself to strike down an unarmed human child who reminded me of my younger sister." The pieces began to fall into place for Marcus. Kira's exile wasn't the result of cowardice or criminal behavior, but of mercy. She had been marked and abandoned because she had chosen compassion over tribal law, and that choice had cost her everything she had ever known. "So they brought you here to die slowly instead of executing you themselves," Marcus said, applying the last of the antiseptic to her wounds. "Death by exposure is considered a cleaner punishment than execution," Kira explained. "It allows the spirits to judge whether the exile truly deserves to die. If someone survives long enough to reach civilization, it is taken as a sign that their offense was not unforgivable." She gestured weakly at her marked body. "But no one has ever survived the full trial. The desert claims us all eventually." Marcus sat back on his heels, surveying his work. Kira's immediate injuries were stabilized, but she would need proper medical attention soon if she was going to make a full recovery. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that helping her meant challenging not just the physical dangers of Xerion Prime, but an entire cultural system built around honor, shame, and the rigid enforcement of tribal law. Outside, the acid storm continued to rage, effectively trapping them in the emergency shelter until it passed. But Marcus found himself strangely grateful for the forced delay. It would give them time to plan their next move, and perhaps more importantly, it would give Kira time to heal both physically and emotionally from the trauma of her abandonment. The acid storm raged outside their shelter for 3 hours, giving Marcus time to observe Kira more carefully as she rested. Despite her injuries and obvious exhaustion, she remained alert and watchful, her amber eyes tracking his every movement with the wariness of someone who had learned never to fully relax. Her warrior training was evident in the way she positioned herself even while lying down, maintaining clear sight lines to both the door and Marcus himself, ready to defend herself despite her weakened condition. Marcus had found emergency rations in the shelter's supplies, along with a water purification system that was still functional. The food was bland but nutritious, designed to sustain mining crews during extended emergencies. He heated a portion and offered it to Kira, who stared at the steaming meal as if it were some kind of elaborate trap. "It's safe," Marcus assured her, taking a bite from his own portion to demonstrate. Standard human field rations. High protein, Essential vitamins. Tastes like recycled cardboard, but it'll keep you alive. Kira accepted the meal hesitantly, eating with the careful precision of someone who had learned to make every calorie count. As she ate, Marcus noticed her watching him with growing curiosity rather than fear. The change was subtle but significant, suggesting that his actions were beginning to override whatever preconceptions she might have held about humans. "You carry yourself like a soldier," she observed between careful bites, "yet you claim to be a surveyor of rocks and minerals." Marcus smiled slightly. "I served in the Terran Defense Corps before I became a geologist. 3 tours on frontier. Worlds mostly peacekeeping and humanitarian missions. Turns out the skills transfer pretty well to field research work." This revelation seemed to surprise Kira. She set down her meal and studied his face intently. "You have fought my people." "Before? Never directly," Marcus replied honestly. "By the time I was deployed, most of the active conflicts between Terran and Velani forces had shifted diplomatic channels. I spent more time building bridges than burning them." He paused, considering his words carefully. "Though I did see the aftermath of some of those earlier battles. Both sides lost good people." Kira nodded slowly, a shadow passing across her features. "I commanded a strike force during the Xerion campaigns. We believed we were defending our territorial claims against human expansion. Only later did I learn that many of the installations we attacked were research facilities and civilian settlements, not military targets." The admission hung between them, heavy with implication. Marcus could see the weight of regret in her expression, the burden of actions taken in the name of duty that had ultimately led to her current situation. Her exile wasn't just punishment for showing mercy to prisoners. It was the culmination of a growing disillusionment with the violent path her people had chosen. "Is that why you couldn't kill the prisoners?" Marcus asked gently. "Because you had seen too much bloodshed already?" Kira was quiet for a long moment, staring at the filtered light coming through the shelter's small window. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of deep personal pain. "The human child in that group reminded me of my sister Nira. Same age, same defiant expression, even in the face of death. Nira died in a human orbital bombardment when I was serving off-world. I had always told myself that her death justified everything I did in battle, every life I took in the name of vengeance." She paused, her hands trembling slightly as she continued. "But looking at that prisoner, I realized that somewhere on a human world, there might be a Velani warrior telling herself the same story about her dead sister. The cycle would never end as long as we kept feeding it with innocent blood." Marcus felt a deep respect for the courage it must have taken for Kira to stand against her entire military culture in that moment. The Velani warrior society was built around concepts of honor and duty that left little room for individual conscience. Yet she had chosen to follow her moral instincts despite knowing the consequences. "What was the human child's name?" he asked. "Sarah," Kira replied immediately. "She told me her name was Sarah Chun and that she was 12 years old. She asked me if dying would hurt very much." Kira's voice cracked slightly. "I told her it would be quick, that she should think of something that made her happy. She said she would think about her brother Marcus, who was away at university studying to become a scientist." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. The coincidence was impossible, yet the details matched perfectly. His sister Sarah had been part of a research expedition to Xerion 7, an archaeological dig that had been attacked by Velani raiders. She had been listed among the casualties, but her body had never been recovered. He had always assumed she had died in the initial assault. "Sarah Chun from New Beijing Colony?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kira's amber eyes widened in recognition and horror. "You are the brother she spoke of. The scientist." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of impossible coincidence and tragic irony. Marcus felt his worldview shifting as he processed the implications. His sister had survived the initial attack, only to be captured and face execution at the hands of Velani raiders. But this same warrior, this woman he had just saved from a slow death in the desert, had been the one to show Sarah mercy in her final moments. What happened to her? Marcus asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. I released all the prisoners during the confusion of a surprise attack by Terran rescue forces, Kira said quietly. I told them to run for the evacuation shuttles and never look back. The last I saw of Sarah, she was helping wounded adults reach safety, even though she could have escaped first. Kira's voice strengthened slightly. Your sister was braver than most of my warriors. She saved lives that day. Marcus felt tears he hadn't shed in years beginning to well up in his eyes. For over a decade, he had carried the pain of not knowing what had happened to Sarah, alternating between hope that she might have survived and despair over the likelihood that she had died afraid and alone. Now he learned that she had not only survived the initial attack, but had shown remarkable courage in helping others escape. Did she make it to the shuttles? Marcus asked. Kira hesitated, clearly struggling with whether to give him hope or prepare him for disappointment. The rescue operation was partially successful. Several shuttles escaped, but the chaos was enormous. Many records were lost, and some survivors were never properly identified in the refugee processing centers. She met his eyes directly. It is possible that Sarah Chun survived that day and lived to see her family again, even if you never knew it. The possibility that his sister might still be alive somewhere, living under a new identity in a refugee settlement, was almost too much to process. But whether Sarah had survived or not, Marcus now understood that Kira had risked everything to give those prisoners a chance at life. The mercy she had shown had cost her everything she had ever known, leading directly to her exile and abandonment in the desert. You saved her, Marcus said simply. Whatever else happened, you gave Sarah and the others a chance they wouldn't have had otherwise. Kira looked down at her hands, still struggling with the emotional weight of their shared revelation. And now you have saved me. Perhaps there is some justice in that, or perhaps it is merely another twist of fate in an already tangled story. Outside, the acid storm was beginning to subside, but neither of them made any move to leave the shelter. Both needed time to process the extraordinary connection that had brought them together and the realization that their meeting was far more than random chance. They had been shaped by the same tragedy, each carrying scars from a conflict that had touched their lives in the most personal way possible. The storm's end brought unwelcome visitors. Marcus's scanner detected multiple heat signatures approaching from the northwest, moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit. Kira recognized the formation immediately through the shelter's observation port. Hunters, she whispered. They have come to verify my death and eliminate any witnesses. 6 Velani warriors on hoverbikes crested the canyon ridge, their energy weapons glinting in Xerion's pale sunlight. Marcus helped Kira to her feet, noting how she straightened. Despite her injuries, transforming from exile back into the warrior she had once been. They will kill you for helping me, she said with quiet certainty. Then we don't let them catch us, Marcus replied, gathering his equipment and activating his emergency beacon. The signal would take hours to reach the nearest human outpost, but it was their only hope of rescue. As the hunters descended into the gorge, Kira made her choice. Instead of hiding, she stepped outside the shelter and called out in her native tongue, her voice carrying across the canyon walls. Marcus couldn't understand the words, but their effect was immediate. The warriors stopped, weapons lowering slightly in apparent confusion. I told them that exile taught me the true meaning of honor, Kira explained. That standing beside those who show mercy is worth more than the approval of those who show none. She looked at Marcus with those luminous amber eyes. I chose my path the day I spared your sister. Today, I choose it again. The lead hunter shouted back, his words harsh and condemning. Kira simply nodded and turned away, dismissing them with the casual authority of someone who had found something more valuable than their judgment. Together, she and Marcus disappeared into the maze of canyon passages, leaving the hunters to report that the exile had found her own way home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.